themselves. Good morning, welcome, and we have actually a very full agenda today, and I hope we can work through it expeditiously. So I won't spend a lot of time in introductory comments, and really I'd just like to begin with Jane, if you are able to just be ready to, well, let's see, we should do the liaison updates first. Okay, so let's just begin with the approval of the minutes from the last meeting. Is everybody okay with the write-up of the last meeting? Would you like to change anything in the minutes? We've done this by consensus, and hearing no concerns, I'll consider the minutes to have been approved, and we'll this may not be the best time, you know, as a routine matter. We've discussed the idea of having reports from our liaison members on, you know, quick updates on the work of our companion committees. And today we put this early in the agenda, just thinking it might help us frame what we're doing. And we can discuss whether we should always do that, but for today, let's just do it that way. Lauren Oates has written to say that she's in the legislature and won't be able to give her update right now, but we can take the other ones and hear from Lauren when she's available.
Rich, before we get too much further, just for everybody's awareness, you'll note that we now have 2 public comment periods in the meeting, an opportunity for the public to weigh in sort of more frequently through the process. We'd like to try to focus it on the issues that have been discussed in sort of the first half and the second half. Obviously, we'll take comment throughout, but that way we can have some more opportunity for the public to weigh in throughout our meetings, given that they're long and maintaining that to the end is a challenge. So appreciate this opportunity and good suggestion from other subcommittees who are doing the work.
Thanks, Peter. Yes, well, in the morning session, the first session is devoted to updates and scheduling issues and discussion of modeling and consulting work ahead of us. And it would be great to have comments on that at the end of that session. And then similarly, in the afternoon, we're going to be talking, in the second session, we'll be talking about 2 of our main issue areas, buildings and transportation. And if you have comments related to that, we'd like to hear comments on that following that committee discussion. Thanks, Peter, for teeing that up. Liaison reports, maybe we should start with Kelly. You seem to be muted. Kelly, your audio is not working. Maybe we should.
Can you hear me now?
Oh,
yes.
Yeah, now you're working.
There's something wrong with my headphones. It kicked me out for a second there. I apologize. As a liaison between this committee and Just Transitions, I'll fill you in a little bit about Just Transitions and what we've been working on. We have 2 main tasks that we're focused on. The first is to provide other subcommittees a tool to be able to rate the equity of the policy recommendations that the other committees are putting forward, so that, you know, it's not just relying on me and my one personal perspective or something to give advice, but something that's a little bit more like a something you can check things against to try to make sure that you've thought through what impacts decisions might have on all Vermonters. And the second thing is developing a public engagement strategy. And again, focusing on making sure that we're engaging a wide variety of Vermonters in the work we're doing and trying to make sure that our public engagement is happening early and often so that, you know, we don't want all the work of the subcommittees to be done and then have the public go, oh my gosh, you can't do this. You know, we want feedback throughout the process. So those are the things we're focusing on. At our last meeting, we also discussed some of the key takeaways we got from the presentation. There was a workshop on environmental justice on April 7th. I think I saw some of you there. So we discussed some of the findings from that and are going to be using those in both our public engagement work and in our providing a tool for the other committees. I don't know that we have an official sort of target deadline for providing that tool. I know it's something we want to at least provide. Oh, Jane might be able to jump in, but we want to be able to provide at least some like preliminary guidelines, and then probably get something more robust as we move into further revisions of our draft. Today we will be finally getting to meet with the public engagement consultants. So our meeting this evening is from 4 to 6, and we'll be able to talk to the consultants for the first time, get a sense of where they're coming from, and I should have more to report in the future on that front. So I think that's all. If there are any questions, let me know.
Any questions for Kelly? Follow up to that.
I have a question. Is that okay?
Go. Yeah,
okay.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Well, thanks, Kelly. That's great. That all sounds really good. Oh, I'm sorry. There's an echo. One of my question is in terms of the tool that you're developing relates to, you know, to what level of detail are our recommendations going to take shape to inform the December 2021 plan, and what other work will be happening in the sort of program design, policy making, you know, arena after that. So, you know, because I feel like a lot of this, we're going to set pretty clear parameters, I hope, and clear direction, and then there will be further rulemaking, program design, policy making, and that's where an opportunity to go deeper. And I feel like that's also the need and the time for application of the principles and the tool that you're going to be developing. And I'm just curious if you guys are thinking about it in that way, or if we can sort of, anyway, I'm sort of thinking about it in that way. Maybe that's not the right way to be thinking about it, but I just wanted to sort of explore that with you all.
Kelly, I don't know if you, well, go ahead, Kelly.
Oh, yeah.
I have some comments on that too. Go ahead. You go ahead, Kelly.
I wanted to make sure, I'm not sure if I got your question, Joey, but yeah, the idea is that, so I'm not, yeah, maybe correct me if I'm getting the wrong end of the stick, but I think the idea is that it's something where we want to make sure we're providing as much as possible, as soon as possible, as far as tools go, but also recognizing that that there will be additional information as we do more public comment and things like that, and that also the primary focus of the other subcommittees is not necessarily on the environmental justice side of things, but that, you know, we're hoping that we can provide something that's easy enough to keep it at front of mind when you're making recommendations, but also you have liaisons and like me and other people to rely on to ask questions and things like that. I don't know if that answers your question.
Jane, do you want to round it out? I mean,
yeah, I'm happy. Let me try and see if I get what you're saying, Joey, too. So I just to put a finer point, I think on what Kelly was speaking to, I think there's the development, like first and foremost, of guiding principles, which isn't in my mind, a tool in it of itself. It's the development of these principles that are supposed to be sort of guideposts for your recommendations and strategies. And that the original timeline for that coming out of the Just Transitions was by the end of April. Not sure we'll get there, but that is the goal, is to have those principles really in front of your work as soon as possible. There's also then the development of an equity assessment tool, which sort of builds off the tool that Susanna Davis has built for like policy, but is broader in some aspects, but also more refined around the impacts specifically of climate change policy development. And that there is no timeline set yet on the milestones by that committee on when and how they plan to do that, aka in-house or through a contract, likely, or through enabling of a DC contract that's happening with the development of some other tools within A&R right now. So that's sort of like put a pin in it, stay tuned, but that's sort of the back end tool, right? Like that's the tool that after you have the recommendations developed, you would run through it. But hopefully the guiding principles will have set you up that when you run through that tool, you won't have any surprises. So those are sort of the tools. I'll just suggest that what I was hearing from you, Joey, is that, of course, there's going to be more work after the plan, right? And so there's going to be the development of rules and policies and strategies and programs that come sort of after the plan, because we'll need to go farther. And I think that like laying the groundwork with those tools and further thought about engagement, equity, planning, all of that will continue an evolution and a continual process even once we go past December 1st. And I think that's what we're starting to think about tonight with the consultant joining Just Transition, and how we start to do early and often an engagement, but how we also recognize that we're not going to come close to doing what we need to by December 1st and set a stage to keep that door open for engagement further as we go deeper into the work. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, I would, and in response, I guess I would say, back to Joey and also, to the full committee, we recognize that a lot of the equity considerations that need to be built into our policies need to be at least understood early in the process. And then, as Jane just said, the details may come later, but I think we need to have our eyes and ears open the whole way through to be able to kind of start to make programmatic design decisions with equity considerations in mind. So I think this is an iterative thing. We're not going to wait till the end to say, okay, how are we going to bolt on some Just Transition considerations? We're going to start that early and make sure that our programs are headed in the right direction. To the degree that this tool can help us do that, Kelly, I think that's exactly what we need to do. So thank you.
I also will just suggest, sorry to interrupt, Kelly, but just that I think when we start to talk about the work planning and milestones today, even today, we'll touch on this topic again, and then it's going to be the focus of the Climate Council meeting that's coming up. Hopefully the steering committee is going to talk about that today, but that's our proposal, is to bring forward this conversation in light of the timeline and the considerations for the draft climate action plan to the full council. For some thoughtful discussion.
All right.
Yeah.
Anything more on this one?
There's one more thing I wanted to add, and thank you, Jane, for clarifying on timelines and all of that, because I didn't have that in my notes. The one other thing that we've talked about in Just Transitions and may sometimes slip out of people's minds is looking at existing policies that we hope to continue, and if we find that those, we should look at those through the equity lens as well. And if we're finding that some of our existing policies that seem great are, disproportionately impacting certain populations, that's something also to be bearing in mind as we do this work. So that's all. Thanks.
Kelly, thank you. Jared, can you give us a report from Science and Data?
Sure thing. And we'll want to ask Jane to add in here as well. But I would say that overall, the two main priorities and areas of focus for the Science and Data Subcommittee have been our work plan development, and then also looking at serving as kind of reviewers and resources with relation to the finalization, the development and finalization of the request for proposals for technical consulting services. So I don't want to steal Jane's thunder. Jane can give the update on the kind of where the RFP stands in terms of its posting and its timeline. And maybe actually I'll just pause here for that if you want to do that, Jane, and then I can continue on and talking about how we in the subcommittee have talked about our role going forward with relation to the RFP and then other components of the work plan that are under development.
Well, that's very gracious that Jared lets me tell the story, since I feel like without Jared and Christine Donovan, we would have no RFP right now. So thank you to Jared and Christine for their tireless help with that. So I really appreciated it. And we did get a lot of feedback, and it does feel really good that it's posted and live. And so it went up yesterday. It's open until May 3rd. So some of the feedback was that the timeline I had originally proposed for proposals to come in was too fast for consultants to put together such a complicated proposal. So it went up on April 14th. They have till May 3rd. That when we get to timeline and work plan, that'll just demonstrate that we're getting a little farther out with some of our analyses than we had originally hoped and planned for. But still feeling pretty good and on track that we can start to make some progress within the subcommittees on getting things ready for those consultants to hit the ground running. And so that's up. Science and Data will be instrumental in review of those proposals, and we can talk about that with all of you too. But I'm hoping Christine's on the call, and I'm hoping that I can tell her that she could help be on the proposal ranking committee as well, since she brought so much input and value to that process. But we want to keep it small. I don't want to keep it so small that we don't have the necessary people around the table to review proposals, but also want to be thoughtful that it'll likely take a lot of time from folks. So I know Jared has stepped up through Science and Data to review proposals and rank them. I'm hoping to have someone from cross-sector. Thinking Christine makes a lot of sense, and she was really helpful, but happy to hear from any of you also who would like to participate. And we'll review and rank those based on the criteria and hope to turn it around fairly quickly. I'm just recognizing how long the negotiation for the climate access outreach and engagement contract has taken. We're still not actually under contract. And it's been weeks. And so I'm mindful that the contract negotiation for this RFP will also take weeks once we get the proposals. So thoughtful about that, but thank you for all the help. And the next phase, I'm not prepared to do this today, but perhaps at your next meeting, I would like to meet with all the subcommittees one more time about just review and consideration of what we got in this RFP, and think about any gaps that you will all still need to put together the climate action plan by December, and any other additional analyses that could be handled through additional small RFPs or contracts or grants to UVM or other components like that. So start to think about that perhaps for the next meeting. Thanks.
Yeah, and this is kind of an overly simplistic summation of the tasks and deliverables in the RFP, but just as a reminder, this is really kind of a review of our existing greenhouse gas emissions inventory methodology and recommendations around that, and the development of a carbon budget that would look at sources and sinks, and not just the sources of gross emissions. And then there is a whole section of the RFP that focuses on all of the economic analysis of the recommendations that I should say economic and related analysis, economic impacts, both positive and on both sides of the ledger, health impacts, etc. But my understanding, Jane, correct me if I'm wrong, I know I made comments on the near final draft. I haven't yet seen the final version that was posted, but I think it's clear in there that what the consultant will be doing is doing analysis, assessing primarily the recommendations for strategies, initiatives, policies that come out of this committee. And so I think it is going to be really important that we have someone from cross-sector mitigation who's got experience with the type of analysis, economic analysis in particular, of proposed policy measures, which Christine certainly has. And if she's available, it would be wonderful to have her as part of that review. I would also note that, with relation to the development of a carbon budget for us to be able to assess net emissions, which will come into play eventually, is called out for the 2050 target, if not for the 2025 and 2030 emissions reduction requirements. That it will be helpful to have folks from the ag and ecosystem, someone from the Ag and Ecosystems or the Agency of Agriculture, who've been involved in a lot of the considerations of how that gets developed. But I believe, Jane, correct me if I'm wrong, that Secretary Moore yesterday was saying, hoping for a smaller sized, nimble group, but that, as you said, nevertheless has the diversity of kind of perspective and expertise necessary to have a full and comprehensive review to make sure that, this is just such a critical foundational piece, getting really highly qualified, very capable consultants to give us the kind of technical resources and reports that will need to inform the climate action plan and the development of all of our work.
So Jared and Christine, can I assume that you will both be involved in reviewing the RFP? Okay. If others are interested in doing so, please just coordinate with Jane.
One question I have for Jane, maybe we can talk about this offline, but it would probably be helpful for this group at some point, is once we get a little bit further in the RFP process and we know how much this set of contractors is going to cost, what do we have left in the kitty in terms of analysis we might need, so we can think about, sort of as we're developing lists of things we might need analysis on, we can prioritize that based on the remaining budget. Obviously, the addition of the $1 million to budget adjustment gives us some more flexibility, and I want to make sure that we've identified needs that we move forward if we're ready. I don't want to get you thinking about another RFP process just yet, but just for the back of our minds.
Yeah, I echo that Christine has the most expertise here, and I won't box her into her idea, but she thought about half of what we have budgeted what this would cost, which could leave anywhere from $300,000 to $400,000 available still for additional contractual work. So, but we'll see. And we didn't put, unlike the other contracts, we didn't specify what we thought we had or what we have available in the bid sheet and through the proposal. We left it really open-ended for the contractors to put forward in their proposal what they thought it would cost, and based on the timeline that we were asking, like, can you do it by this timeline? And if so, what are you going to need to make sure that you can meet the timeline? So
I'd also just say quickly, I'm not 100% sure about this yet, but I believe, especially because he was very involved as well in the RFP development and is co-chair of the Science and Data Subcommittee, that it's likely that TJ Poore from the Public Service Department would also be a reviewer, which would be great.
Yes, TJ said he would review it. He's a glutton for punishment. So
wonderful. I think the last thing to say in terms of an update from the Science and Data Subcommittee is that we've been really focused on work plan development. Catherine, who I believe is on the call from CBI, Consensus Building Institute, helped facilitate, along with the other co-chair, Dr. Leslie and Dupini-Giroux, a great kind of idea flip exercise where we could identify kind of sources of science and data and kind of potential uses of that and the stakeholders. And happily, the going through that process, I think, really aligned with the draft work plan that was already in development. I think we're going to have to do a little bit more to identify some of the science and data needs in terms of our climate assessments, in terms of expected climate impacts on Vermont in the years ahead. But at least as a first task, there was really clear alignment that we, both for the purposes of the Science and Data Subcommittee and in preparation for the RFP, and working with a consultant, a first step is just getting down on paper a summary of the existing methodology and the methodological choices of how the state's greenhouse gas inventory is done. So for instance, like when we do a sectoral analysis of emissions from the transportation sector, you know, the EPA provides different state inventory tools. They're called SIT tools. Which one is Vermont? Just so we all have a common reference point of the methods that are currently being used, so that we can all be on the same page and then know which questions to ask as we go through the review, and then further development of emissions tracking tools for the purposes of the council and the state. So I think that'll probably be the next. I have not heard directly from TJ and Leslie Ann, our co-chairs, but I think based on the conversation we had yesterday, it's likely that conversation and review related to the inventory process and methodology is likely to be kind of coming up as a main focus and priority area for us. I think that's it from me.
Whoops. Thanks, Jared. I'm reading a note from Liz Miller, who said that the connection wasn't working. Liz, were you in a separate place with without any other participants?
Oh, maybe that was the problem. I couldn't even do a chat before or hear, but now everything, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. So now everything's working. I was about 15 minutes delayed when I tried to pop on. I don't know if you could see me before, but anyway, it's working now.
Okay, well, welcome. Glad you're here. We're going through the liaison reports right now. Any other liaison reports? I can let the committee know that we received a request from the Rural Resilience Subcommittee to appoint a liaison member of this committee, and they recommended Chad Farrell be added. Just as a matter of process, the way we decided previously that this would work is that would be a decision taken to the steering committee. I understand the steering committee will be meeting later today. Is that right?
Yes.
So let me just make a note that I hope you will be able to take action on that request.
It's on the agenda.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. And if Charles, I can't see that Chad's actually on this call, but I can't see everybody. So if he's there, I'm going to say welcome, and we'll hope to hear from you later. And Lauren is not yet back. Is that right? All right. So let's just hear from her if we have a chance later or next time.
So do you want me to take 5 minutes quickly and talk about the investments before we move on to so we don't lose that somewhere in the process?
I would love to, Peter.
Okay.
And Peter and Richard, Lauren did provide her update in the email, so she wouldn't have to give it later. If you want to just keep it on point, I can tell you her two comments. Sure. Her two comments
Great.
were, one, the work in the Ag Ecosystem Subcommittee has been her effort. They've been focused on the development of a multi-criteria analysis tool, specifically looking at how to incorporate co-benefits and ranking primary strategies that come out of that group. And in my response back to her, I just said, we're going to talk a little bit more about that tomorrow at the meeting, because they can be very powerful tools and could help. And she thought about sharing that with all of you as a possibility, which is a great idea. They can also be very cumbersome tools. that don't always get us where we know we need to go. And then if it doesn't rank out what we want, then what's the benefit of them in some way? So there's like questions about transparency and how you would use those. So, but Ag and Ecosystems has done a really good job with Lauren, Alyssa White, and David Mears in thinking about the applicability of a multi-criteria tool in that subcommittee for those strategies and recommendations. And then second, she also just suggested that the non-energy sector is meeting collaboratively. I assume that's with you, Peter, with Ag and Ecosystems members and DEC staff and Ag agency staff in the coming days to talk about ag emissions.
Any questions for Jane about Lauren's report?
No.
Thank you, Jane. That was very concise. All right, then. So, Peter, you're up.
I'm going to do this in the easiest way possible. I'm going to share a quick PowerPoint table that just shows precisely what the breakdown of the investments look like. So can everybody see that? So these are proposals, right? This is early on in the legislative process. The legislature has already done some work to try to expend ARPA funding before it was passed and we knew precisely what it could be used for. Governor's proposal broke down into kind of 5 buckets. Water and wastewater specifically called out in the bill. There's $170 million there. There's about $249 million for the housing proposal. I think it's $250 for broadband, and then another 100 and something for economic development and capital related projects. But within the climate change bucket, the piece that I really appreciated, I would call out the sort of bottom line above the total, which was a recognition that we're all working, right? And that we are going to identify policies that are going to need investments. And so setting aside $100 million for us to inform, obviously it's not pocket money, it has to go through the normal process, but to be able to think about the things that we need to do and where our resources are needed, that's a pretty important piece. The other ones are pretty much, we know we need to do it, let's get on with it, and it will just add to our sort of existing slate of programs and policies. So that's a significant additional investment in electric vehicle infrastructure, charging infrastructure, additional monies for weatherization to build on what the governor proposed in his initial budget, more incentives for the electrification of different things, whether that be heating systems or vehicles or what have you. And then a really excellent concept of taking the sort of FEMA related hazard mitigation buyout program down to a state scale, which would enable us to widen the opportunities for low-lying areas that are often flooded, help vulnerable Vermonters get out of properties that they have trouble getting out of because they have sort of underwater, quite literally and figuratively, from a financial perspective, because they flood regularly. And so those are sort of the buckets. It's a beginning of a conversation with the legislature. Really excited about those pieces and really excited that that's where, in the governor's mind, that's where we should focus the sort of once in a lifetime resources from this bill. The other piece to bear in mind is that if the infrastructure bill passes, that Congress is just starting to chew on now, that will add a whole nother level of funds that we all don't fully know about yet. And so lots to go, and just we'll continue to figure out what that could look like. But pretty exciting opportunities for us to be thinking about as we're doing our work.
Peter, can I just chime in for a second? Just on the electrification incentives, one aspect that's also relatively small in that $29 million bucket is load management platforms and discussion of choreographing flexible loads like EVs and heat pumps with, when the sun is shining, when the wind is blowing. And that's one that I think is really important that we think about, both from, because it helps tie in the thermal, transportation, and electric sector. So it's a relatively small amount in the total dollars, but pretty important.
Thanks, Ed. Other comments or questions about this? I just have one, large scale comment, I guess, which is that this availability of revenues on this scale, both through the pandemic relief legislation and potentially the infrastructure legislation, and as Peter said, is a really exciting bit of news, important bit of news. As we consider the range of possible policy options available to us, frequently we just find ourselves falling into a hole or stumbling over the fact that we don't know how to at least bring on board the initial funding. And I think it gives me some serious hope that we might be able to come up with a package that meets our statutory obligations and could actually be launched. So I think it's really important that we keep our eye on those potentially available funds. Thanks, Peter.
I would agree. I think it also makes our job potentially more complicated given the uncertainty potential of the infrastructure money coming down the pike. And so it's another sort of variable for us to be aware of.
Well, and I don't to a Vermont audience, but I don't think we're going to get crazy about how we think about spending free money or money that feels like it's just coming to us out of the blue. We have a huge set of tasks in front of us, and we're going to have sharp pencils as we think about how to apply these resources, and that's not different from anything we've ever done in the past. So just underscoring the point.
Yeah, all I was suggesting was that as we think about different sort of push-pull techniques that we might consider, how much sort of opportunity for incentives and other things we have may affect the way we approach things. And so it's a bit of it makes it a variable in my mind in terms of where the opportunities are. So just we can leave that there. Happy to provide any more detail if anybody would like it. But we can move on to the next topic.
All right, Peter. Thank you for the important bit of hopeful news. And Jane, can you lead us through a conversation on what we know now about work plan, flow, timing, consultant assistance, et cetera?
Sure. Thank you. And so Peter and I think, are going to tag team this, but I'll set the stage a bit with some ongoing work and some considerations to the milestones and timelines that have been previously shared, in hopes that you all can move towards some refinement with some work planning efforts for the subcommittee. So I'll just start by suggesting that there's a couple sort of pivotal meetings coming up that I hope will provide some more clarity on both the deliverables and as well as the timeline around how we will be informed and how public engagement will shape the work of the subcommittees. So as Kelly and I alluded to at the beginning, tonight will sort of be the kickoff meeting with respect to our contractor being brought on board, Climate Access, who will be managing outreach and engagement for the work of the Climate Council. They will meet with the Just Transitions Committee this evening and present essentially their proposal and what they thought about, especially at this critical stage around stakeholder engagement, and then hear from the Just Transitions Committee of any feedback or refinement on that process. Have a conversation back and forth tonight. And then the Just Transitions Committee will have one more week, either with or without Climate Access, to sort of further refine what they see as the role of both public engagement broadly and the role of Just Transitions more narrowly in supporting other subcommittees in their outreach and engagement, recognizing that it'll be an all hands on deck sort of work with respect to the public engagement component, guided by both the contractor and Just Transitions. And so that our hope is then to tee that conversation up for the Climate Council as one of the more substantive items that we bring to the Climate Council at the April meeting, in hopes of providing some context on what we can and can't do between now and December 1st, and sort of taking everybody's pulse to ensure we're comfortable with the kind of engagement we think we can do between now and then, and what will sort of be setting the seed, planting the seed, I should say, for further out work after December 1st. And so that will tee up the conversation that will also happen at the April meeting, and then start today at the steering committee meeting around what we expect to be able to deliver in the December 1st climate action plan more broadly. And so there is the draft outline now for the climate action plan. It's very draft. That was further refined after the steering committee first looked at it 2 weeks ago. They'll look at it again today as presented to them, and then we'll tee up that conversation for the full council in a week from now, and hopefully have, again, a substantive conversation about what we can and can't do for December 1st, and recognize the role of the council in approving the plan and starting to build consensus on what that plan can look like based on the timeline in front of us. My hope is that as we sort of get past that April deadline, or it's not deadline, but milestone of meeting with the council, we'll have more clarity and grounding in the plan, and that will help me then support all of you in providing templates to feed up and into to start to build the climate action plan, whether that is in the form of what strategies look like, what recommendations look like. All of that will sort of be able to be further refined once we've adopted an outline and a consensus around what will be included in the December 1st plan. So that's all sort of forthcoming. So there's still this sort of big unknown, I'll just sort of say for me, and I think for everybody, about what engagement looks like. We have these sort of, early and often we keep saying, but we're almost at June. And that's sort of supposed to be, you'll remember, a milestone where we have critical public engagement and are starting to test strategies and recommendations coming out of subcommittees. But yet we want to have stakeholder feedback before we get there. So we're not going out with already baked ideas. We have received input to those before that. So it's sort of a chicken and egg thing for me about well, what can we really do with them just coming on board, and June as a milestone for engagement. So that's sort of put a pin in it and stay tuned. But I'll just share that two other components, obviously. Let me first share and remind you, I believe that I shared this timeline last time I was here, but there's been some movement now, the estimation of getting the RFP out by right after the last Climate Council meeting didn't happen. And so we're not that far off, but again, it's mid-April now and the RFP was just issued. I think that likely means that, we won't have any technical contractors on board till the earliest mid-May, because the RFP closes May 3rd. I think mid-May is quite ambitious, though, having seen how long it's taken us to negotiate the communications contract. So I think a more likely scenario is that the contractors are on board at the end of May, which essentially means if we are going out for engagement in June, we won't have any of our analyses complete. However, we still have the analyses undertaken by the Public Service Department and Department of Environmental Conservation in service of the Comprehensive Energy Plan and beyond. And those analyses are moving forward quite well. The expectation is that we will have a draft business as usual model any day. It was supposed to be mid-April. It hasn't come yet, but they haven't given any indication that they're way off track. So that's really great. some of the other conversation that's really getting underway, as Jared alluded to in the Science and Data Committee yesterday and beyond, internal conversations at the agency and collaboratively with Ag Agency and elsewhere, is thinking about the greenhouse gas inventory, building a foundation of better understanding of how the greenhouse gas inventory is handled now and what we really want the consultants to do and analyze for us. So there'll be a science and data meeting focused on that question. I believe we concluded yesterday that it will be next week, although I wasn't sure if we decided to put a pin in that for the following week, knowing that we're still working on work planning. But regardless, in the next week or two, we will look at the greenhouse gas inventory. The carbon budget had a lot of thought put into it. I'd encourage you to look at it if you haven't, the way it was refined in the RFP with ag and ecosystems input, as well as DEC input, recognizing how integral that is with respect to coordination with the greenhouse gas inventory. So that had a lot of work going into it. I think we can keep moving along sort of development of methodology for that, so that when the contractor's on board, we can really hit the ground running with the analysis of the greenhouse gas inventory as well as the carbon budget. So really those deliverables should be able to happen pretty quickly once they're on board, is my limited understanding, as well as starting to think about how we add in other components to the work of the Comprehensive Energy Plan model, the LEAP model, which thinking about further scenario development that they can work on our behalf with, as well as sort of finalizing the business as usual model, which could help and inform your work. So regardless, we won't have significant technical analysis done in June for any engagement. We're really going to start to see things come July, I would expect, maybe even August. The other critical component was public engagement, again, in October, meaning that we would have to have a draft climate action plan ready for that engagement component in October. So I just want to say that over again. We would have to have a whole plan written by October. I just feel like that's a big milestone if we want to have a final plan by December. So and think the steering committee and the council will start to think about what the December 1st deadline means, and what how the legislature has given authority to the Climate Council to approve the plan. That perhaps could mean that we have a complete draft plan by December 1st. That enables us to have those no regrets policies and strategies really that we have all fleshed out for the legislative session, but it also gives us the winter to do more thoughtful public engagement and perhaps have a final plan by March 1st. It's just one option that feels more in line with sort of the timeline that we have teed up. And I just want to say this, and I'm sure maybe you all know this already, and it was eye-opening for me, but the idea of the Global Warming Solutions Act before COVID hit was that it would have been passed in the spring. It didn't get passed till the fall, and then there was a veto override, took time to stand up the council, and the timeline was never adjusted. So it was always the same timeline, having expected the bill to be passed in the spring. So I actually think having a full, complete plan by December 1st, just recognizing calling it draft, feels very doable based on the timeline here, but that of course it's not my decision, it's on all of you, but I'm just presenting the authority sits with the Climate Council to consider that. So just here we have the public engagement in June, we have the engagement again in the fall, and those are movable based on where we are and what we think comes out of the conversation with the Climate Council. So let me stop sharing this and share one more thing before I turn it over to Peter. Let's see. I just wanted to remind everybody that this was what was shared with the full council and all of you at one point or another in the last few weeks, months. But these are the sort of major milestones that we need to be thinking about if we want to have that complete draft plan by the end of September to go out with public engagement in October. So the idea would be that in April right now, you would have been evaluating your potential pathways and presenting that to the council. We're not asking that of subcommittees for this April meeting, recognizing that we think that the meat of that conversation with the full council should be around the public engagement process, the draft climate action plan, and therefore building milestones based on what we expect to be in that climate action plan. And then 3, thinking about the role of the Climate Council over the next few months in supporting the subcommittees. So sort of tabling that, but this is still where you're supposed to be with respect to milestones. And then the framework and strategies are supposed to be coming in May to have the first set of those to bring out to public engagement in June. So again, these are like the big bucket items. There was the Gantt chart. I have found and heard from many of you that the Gantt chart isn't really helpful for work planning for all of you, but I encourage you to think about a timeline based on the work that you've started to dive into that gets us at these core components of the work and what feels right, knowing when you'll have what technical analysis and where we need to go with public engagement. So that's my overview, Peter, but I'm happy to speak to anything else that I might have missed.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Jane, and I'm gonna, if you could leave this slide up, I think
Great.
that might be useful. I'm interested in the group's perspective on seeing these dates and how much anxiety it produces in terms of developing draft framework and strategies. That's essentially a month from now to get those ready and get them ready for presentation to the full council.
Comments from committee members?
Christine, your hand is up. Is that for now or is that from previous? Okay. You're muted.
Sorry. I think it depends on how one defines draft framework and strategies. And I would think that the calendar will define it for us to be high level draft framework and strategies. I can't see how it could be real micro level, detailed draft framework and strategies within a month, but that's just my own personal point of view.
This is Dave Farnsworth. I agree with Christine's observation. It's not entirely clear to me how we're going to hand off what we think are big ticket items, policies that would support pathways that we think are the right ones, or probably the right ones, to consultants who are going to analyze those and quantify the effects that those policies will have. We really need that support before we can stand behind policies and say, yes, these are the ones we think are the right answers. So there's going to be some vagueness without that support from the consultants.
Any comments from transportation folks?
I guess I would just sort of echo what Christine underscored. It's unclear to me at this moment. I mean, we clearly have a lot of work to do, and there will be ongoing further refinement on, again, program policy design. One thing I just would, the way I think about it, I mean, we have a really clear charge and a lot of work to do. You laid that out very clearly, Jane, and I appreciate how you laid that out. I feel like a big piece of our charge, and maybe this is something we can be working, I'm really interested in working with the Just Transition Subcommittee. I'm very excited about the team that they're bringing on board. I mean, and I think that one of our critical focuses and that we need to continue to look at is like, we need to be reducing fossil fuel consumption. So I sort of, as a core component of our ability to make progress towards these milestones, and we need to be achieving other really important outcomes at the same time and centering really important things like equity and the just transition. So I do wonder about as you know, I'm wondering about how other subcommittees are thinking about that, and I have not had the opportunity to dig in as deeply, but I do think if maybe the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee, so we can create greater reverberation between their important work and ours, if we lay out a couple of things that are informing our high-level thinking about the strategies that each of the different task groups are looking at, you know, I feel like it's like, you know, these are the core things that we need to be doing, which is reducing our reliance on imported fossil fuels and the combustion of those fossil fuels. And then, you know, sort of identifying a few of the different strategies that we know are going to be needed to do that, electrifying a lot, reducing a lot, you know, and a bunch of other strategies. So I kind of wonder about if there are principles that we can be sharing early on to create that greater reverberation around the core stuff we know we are going to need to do.
One very simple, one very basic observation is I'm not sure what pathways means versus strategies versus programs. Knowing what level of detail that we are expected to do at what time and then what the consultants will contribute is really important to me. And I think we should all be striving to be consistent, all the various participants in the plan. What's a pathway? What's a strategy? What's a program? To what degree of detail are we getting into in those various areas?
That's a great point, Catherine. This is Jared. I would just offer that the way that I've been understanding and using that terminology, and this is a good check to see if others agree with this, and I think the way that it shows up in the RFP, where there's additional language that makes this a bit clearer, is that pathways are primarily around sectoral pathways and technical measures, kind of through efficiency and through kind of directly reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the type of technical actions that can be taken within the various sectors, transportation, thermal, electricity, non-energy, et cetera. The policies is in my understanding a next level. We're designing policies, proposed initiatives or programs that would then achieve the level, the pace and change of emissions reducing activity that we've identified through the sectoral pathways and the technical measures. And I feel like we have a really strong foundation with that through the EAN emissions reduction pathways, which were shared with SEI and NESCOM for their work on the LEAP modeling for the Comprehensive Energy Plan. And my understanding is that's what they're coming out with as well. It will be interesting and important to see, you know, if there are any differences between those and where and why. But I think we have a very solid foundation on what are the sectoral pathways and technical measures to reduce emissions. But then there's that next level, next order question about, okay, then what are the regulatory frameworks, the policies that can actually achieve that, which I imagine, which I see as more of the focus of this group's work plan over the next, you know, couple of months at least.
Yeah, so I think, so Jane put in the chat that once she has the sort of outline in place, it will be helpful to sort of, I think, to clarify those pieces. I think the one question that I have maybe for all of us is that looking at our calendar and trying to turn this into sort of get back to the work plan process, in essentially 4 weeks, we have our last meeting before the May Climate Council meeting. I think the idea then we would get together and talk through what of those pathways, strategies, and programs we would sort of be wanting to put forward and discuss them as a subcommittee. Does that seem like a reasonable, if it's a high level overview of this is what we, you know, this is the sector it hits, what we anticipate the outcomes to be, the kind of additional detail we need, especially in terms of sort of order of magnitude of the dial and levers that we're pulling and turning and what have you.
So what all of resources, I'm sorry, I'm getting feedback. Is there someone with a who needs to mute? Oh, it stopped. So two things. I want to. This isn't. We're thinking out loud here about how to deal with the schedule and how to make sure we're moving ahead as with reasonable speed, recognizing that at this moment we don't have technical consultants yet helping us, and we don't yet have outreach and public engagement consultants yet helping us, and so we don't want to get too far down the line before engaging in a public engagement process of some kind, and before having technical consultants who will help us run some numbers and advise us about strategy ideas. So I'm echoing Peter here. I do think, nevertheless, that we know enough and our task leads know enough that we can present at a high level to the full council an overview of the major issue areas and likely sketch some policy ideas that we know from past experience, prior climate council type engagements, and our own recent work, that we could present some high level report on where we think we're headed. We're helped in this by what Jared just said. That is, we have done substantial pathways analysis in Vermont, number one. And number two, the legislation tells us that to the degree possible, we need to make ensure that our reductions are proportionate across sectors. So at least at this point in time, we're not scratching our heads thinking, well, how much can we get from transportation versus how much do we need to get from buildings versus how much are we going to get from agriculture? We're at least at this, so far in the process, we're able to bound our targets by sector. So given all of that, I'm going to echo Peter's implicit suggestion that we organize ourselves towards a report in the May council meeting that would frame the state of our thinking on these, on the major pathways, sectors, and possible program ideas that would yield significant savings there.
So I'm going to make a statement and look for nodding heads. We're going to have conversation around the first cuts on transportation and heating now, this later in this meeting. We'll do the two other sectors at the next meeting. And then by the following meeting with guidance, we will have developed sort of draft templates of ideas for us to discuss and forward on to the full council. I'm seeing lots of nodding heads. Unless anybody has a major issue with that, I do think we should get to public comment, given that we're behind, and so we can have a full break, given the marathon nature of this meeting and everybody's commitment to the process. All right, so agreed.
So it's hard for me to see everybody's hands, but I see Jeff Forward is got his hand up. Jeff.
First off, I want to thank you. One of the wonderful things about living in Vermont is that we have such high quality people willing to volunteer their time on such important topics. And you guys are doing amazing work. I would like to encourage you to think about different levels of recommendations. As Rich mentioned, we have lots of program ideas on the table right now and over the past 5, 10, 15 years, really, that are actionable and actionable relatively quickly. within the next legislative session, for example. And then there are going to be other recommendations that are going to take more time. And I think you're going to, you're already beginning to identify them. You're going to identify more, and you haven't really even gotten into, the controversial stuff yet. So, in your thinking, I'm hoping what you'll be able to do is think in terms of what is actionable in the short term. And specifically, I'm thinking about next legislative, the second year of the biennium. And also thinking on further recommendations on how to continue this work into the future, because it's not going to end in December. This is a long-term problem that's going to take long-term solutions and long-term work. But again, thank you for all you're doing. I really appreciate it, as many of us Vermonters do.
Thanks, Jeff. That's really good counsel. We do have varying degrees of process. We also have programs on the books that can be scaled up that are already built. And so that should be a certain incorporation into people's thinking. So thanks for that thought.
Any other public comments on this portion of the meeting? There's one other hand up. I think it might be Joey. Maybe that's an artifact.
Joey and her phantom hands.
Okay, there we go. As Peter points out, we're running a little behind, and it's time for a break. So let's take 10 minutes now. Come back at 12:25.
There's one more hand.
There's one more hand.
Hi, can you hear me?
Go ahead, George.
Go ahead.
Okay, late to the party, sorry about that. Just a short observation. I think it's good news that there's actually now a funding source for all these various activities. I think one of the key challenges that you're probably going to have to do is a long-term plan in parallel to your short-term plan. My own estimate of looking at this problem area is that the scale of what you're trying to take on is going to take perhaps decades. So this initial amount of money is really, from my perspective, it's a good way to start your organizational structures that can last you for the next several decades. And the question becomes, what organization is carrying on the day-to-day execution of your plan? In other words, where's all this going to land? Is it one central entity that kind of watches over a bunch of smaller entities? What kind of entities are they? Are they utilities? Are they nonprofits? Are they partnerships with corporations? What mix of them do you want to have and fund it and get them started on this? And then in the long term, you're going to have this funding mechanism to carry the ball further to the final goalpost. So unfortunately, it's a balancing act. I know in the short term, you need to do all the things you already are talking about, but you also have to keep in mind the long term, the long game, which is also in this puzzle. Thank you.
Thanks, George. So let's. Is there someone else? Okay, let's take our break now. We'll be back in 10 minutes. All right, folks, we should be assembling. I apologize, the way Teams is working for me, I can't see everybody, and I'm trying to get the large gallery view and it's not working. So is someone able to tell me, do we have a quorum present? Looks like we're getting there.
I believe we do now. I think the reason why you weren't getting large gallery view is there weren't more than 9 people with their screens on. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So people were just waiting for us to start talking. All right, welcome back, everybody. We're going to spend the remainder of this meeting in a preview of coming attractions, I guess is, one way of putting it. As we discussed earlier today, and we've discussed in the past, we are in a bit of a chicken and egg world, and in 3 ways. They may be sort of chicken egg and other chicken and other egg, because we're developing major policy ideas without yet the economic analysis that would help us to refine them. And we're also developing those ideas before a significant public engagement process, recognizing that, to be fair to members of the public, people need to understand what the major policy options are in order to evaluate them and give us good feedback about them. So we need to do this in an iterative way, and to let people know that we are listening, and we will be listening to public engagement and to our companion committees as we develop these ideas. I say that as a prelude so that people can understand that we're asking our task leaders to do something pretty hard, which is tell us what the big ideas are. Tell us how you think you would go about it, recognizing that a lot of change may happen along the way. So we're not baking anything, carving anything into stone right now, but we are beginning the conversation. And as we discussed in the last meeting, we have a lot of background in past work to draw on. So I'm saying that in order to give the task leads some comfort that we would like your best thinking right now, and we expect that it will be modified over time. We've asked Catherine Morris from CBI to help us through this next couple of discussion periods. So thanks, Catherine. I see you're with us, and I'd like to just begin by asking Dave Farnsworth to tell us where the buildings sector group is at right now, and what ideas are you thinking about?
Thank you,
and Richard, can I jump in? This is Catherine, just to say that as we're going through this presentation, I'm hoping that when we get to the discussion, what we'll do is have the cross-sector members be able to give their best advice and their reactions. But as you're going through your presentation as task leads, if there are places where you would really like some input from specific input from the cross-sector mitigation members, if you could just flag that as you're going through, and I think that would help our discussion be more focused. So thanks, Richard. Sorry for the interruption.
That's excellent, and I'm turning this session over to you, so feel free to guide us along.
Thanks, Rich. Thanks, Catherine. Please let me know if you can see my screen properly here. Are you able to see that? Should be a facing page.
We see your screen control page. If you want to share the actual presentation rather than your slide controls, that might be a better. So if you unshare through Teams and then share the actual presentation, right now you're sharing the like your control panel. That's Teams and Zoom and multiple, or now that you're on there, bring the presentation. Right now you're actually sharing one of your screens with us, I believe. That's fine if you want to do that. That works. No.
But that right now does not.
We get the presentation, but it's in the smaller view where we get your sort of presenter mode. That works.
Okay, yeah, because I've made some notes, and I think everybody would benefit from Dave having notes. Great, thanks everybody. And Christine and I have knocked this around. Please weigh in, Christine, at any point here. So as Rich mentioned, there have been discussions about carbon and buildings going on in Vermont for a lot of years. What I'm going to do is list a handful of policies. They're not going to be in priority order. I'll do that in a few minutes, but I just wanted to make a couple observations up front here. So as we engage in these discussions, I want to make sure this committee and all of us who are engaged here recognize certain principles. I think they're important principles. When we discuss this, I'm hoping that we can develop policies that will apply benefits across the entire state and advance the principles of energy equity. And when I use that term, I'm using it really broadly. It's not just low income, it's rural versus urban. It's people with heating, who heat their homes with oil. It's those who do it with wood. There's undoubtedly a racial overlay here as well, even though we're in Vermont, which is very monolithic in that respect. It's also need to be fair to enterprises and the employees of those enterprises that have historically delivered a lot of the fuels that we're talking about. So equity here is a key consideration when we think about the benefits and the costs that we're going to be talking about. This discussion is bound to be controversial. You can't protect everyone from every cost that might arise if you're going to do something about meeting these global warming solution goals. And the long and the short of it is that we have a mandate to meet these standards, and we have to try to do that in the most equitable way. That's my view. We're interested in policies that will deliver long-term savings across energy bills and the environment. So what follows, I'm just going to tee up the conversation, and hopefully this will help in us putting together recommendations before the larger Climate Commission, and will be sufficiently clear that consultants can eventually take these things, analyze them, and put just a sharper focus on the things we're talking about here. So what I've done is look at EAN pathways. I think it's a useful starting point. I think they're the latest information, the most focused information on this topic of thermal issues related to buildings. I'm not their representative. They don't want me to represent their work, I'm sure, but I think they provide really good information. It's based on US DOE, Energy Information Administration information. It's based on information from ANR. But basically what we're talking about here is what would the relationship between fuel switching, in other words, Vermont going from a high to a lower carbon content fuels, and energy efficiency, weatherization look like in 5 years, 10 years, and all the way out to 2050. This table illustrates carbon content of building fuels available to Vermont. Note the carbon content pounds of CO2 equivalent per million BTUs. And I'm just providing some examples here, but what you see is fuel oil. 164 pounds of CO2 equivalent per MMBTU, natural gas and propane. And over here in this column, you see what sort of proportions of the fuel use we're talking about. These are big chunks of our use. On the other hand, you look at electricity by source, wood use, and you can see the CO2 emissions, and you can see how much they're being used today. So this discussion is what fuels need to go, what fuels must we adopt, and this is intended here just to give you a sense of the challenge that decarbonizing the building sector presents to us. This is just a further illustration, what you've got here. The building sector, let's put it this way, the residential sector is the largest share. You see it's 55%. We have over 250,000 permanently occupied homes in Vermont. Is every one of those going to be weatherized by 2050? Fuel oil and LPG, what I typically call propane, is about 80% of residential emissions. Add natural gas, that's an additional 14%. The same fuels are involved in commercial buildings, as you can see here in the next cluster over on the left-hand side here, although the proportions are a little different. There are about 25,000 businesses in the state. Industrial energy use here has a lot to do with process heat. This is a figure that was developed by Lee Seddon, and I think it gives you a really nice perspective of the directionality of some of these factors that I've just breezed through here. As you can see, what we've got is a figure depicting energy use in Vermont buildings. The blue bars, that's the thermal energy load, the BTUs that have to be decreased between 20 and 2050. And you can see how those blue bars go down slightly over that period. The orange bars are the total fossil energy. And you can see how they go down significantly between 2020 and 2050. And there's a commensurate increase in the green bars. That's low carbon energy. They're brought on while hopefully the carbon intensive fuels are reduced. Now the yellow line is measured by the metrics on the right side of that figure. That yellow line is just the total thermal greenhouse gas emissions measured in metric tons of CO2 equivalent. So here's the list of the policies that I'm proposing we consider here. It's not an exhaustive list. I don't mean to imply a priority. None of these comes without controversy, as I suggested earlier. But what you've got when you look at buildings, buildings need to be weatherized. Typical weatherization of buildings reduces their energy use somewhere between 20 to 25%. Deep weatherization doubles that. It's expensive and much greater effort. But weatherization of buildings very likely is going to be a big piece of this puzzle. Additional policies related to buildings, disclosure, energy disclosure. I mean, when you buy a car, you can tell how many miles it gets per gallon. Why can't you do that with a building? Well, people who work at the legislature will tell you all sorts of reasons why you should and all sorts of reasons why you shouldn't. But it's something that would affect consumers and give us more information to make better decisions. Building benchmarking about the energy use in buildings. Codes that would affect how, what sort of standard of efficiency a building has to meet when it's a new construction here in Vermont. Transfer tax support. There's information out there that suggests that energy efficiency investments, a significant amount of those investments occur 6 months before a building is sold and in the first 6 months after a building has been acquired. Is there any way to use the tax system to promote more of that activity? So that's buildings. Consider fuels, which to me is the other pathway in the way that Jared described that earlier on before we took our break. Heat switching, advanced wood heat. Okay, that's a large swath of discussion, but getting current users of other fuels to adopt more efficient wood heat. Electrification, it's a big topic that we've been talking about. Heat pump water heaters, the use of heat pumps in buildings. The adoption of a clean heat performance standard. Think of a renewable performance standard that requires a certain percentage of what is sold. In the case of, we use the shorthand for this group of fuels, unregulated fuels today. Think of an RPS sort of mechanism that would apply to them, that would set a reduced amount of carbon to be achieved, that would allow trading, that would allow certain activities to be credited. It's a performance standard, so it allows the different solutions to come forward to the degree that they're more feasible for customers, to the degree they're more feasible for businesses to promote, and to the degree they're more cost effective. The adoption of renewable fuels would be part of that. Changing other sources of heat obviously would be part of that. And then there are equipment standards itself. What sort of requirements could be put into place that would ensure that more efficient heating equipment is adopted? So anyway, that's a quick rundown of policies. I've only chosen one other subsector here as to discuss what I'm calling coordination. But obviously the power sector itself will have a lot to do with how buildings use energy. And so when we think about integrated resource planning, for example, how rate designs encourage the use of heat pumps, for instance, or how direct load control can take the use of heat pump water heaters or heat pumps in buildings and use that to optimize the power system and make better use of the existing system. In other words, to do smart charging that we understand for EVs, but why can't you do smart charging for water heating, for example? The concept make ready is used typically for electric vehicles, but the idea of building new buildings so they're ready for electrification instead of having to go in and do expensive retrofits. Adopting an efficiency standard of some sort for all fuels. Taking a look again at Tier 3, I call it Tier 3 2.0. Is Tier 3 stringent enough? Does it need to be made more stringent? Does it need to expand how it does things? Tier 3 has been a very successful program. Should it stay the way it is, or are there improvements that could be made? Alternative regulation for utilities. In other words, how can utilities be paid to do these sorts of things that the Global Warming Solutions Act is asking us to do? Other supportive programs, a fuel neutral efficiency standard, where basically you can meet efficiency standards by doing the best thing, not the best natural gas thing or the best electric thing, but by doing the most efficient thing, whatever that may be. Adopting creative financing is an additional thing here. We have efficiency programs, but how can we encourage landlords whose tenants really aren't in a position to make investments? How can we encourage landlords to make those investments on behalf of tenants, even though their tenants are paying energy bills? There are appliance standards and programs. There's existing fossil gas. How should we look at how new natural gas infrastructure is treated? Should depreciation be accelerated so it helps us meet these goals in some sort of way? Is there a future for continuing incentives for fossil fueled appliances and for providing incentives to build new natural gas infrastructure? So anyway, here are a list of things I toss out to you all. We obviously have to improve our energy consumption of buildings by improving how those buildings work themselves with weatherization or deep weatherization to get those reductions, that conservation effect. There are changes that we need to adopt to in the way that we fuel our buildings. What I refer to here as heat switching. There are challenges across the sector, both to make it more efficient and to change those sources out. And I think I'm going to leave it here, and I welcome your comments and observations. Thank you very much.
That was perfect. Thank you very much for, I think if you leave the your last slide up, that might be helpful for our discussion. And I want to propose for this portion of the, and then also follow on for the transportation sector discussion, that there's really two objectives. One is just to make sure that everybody, all the members, have a good understanding of what all of these options and policies and what they mean or what they are. So I want to be sure that we have some time for clarifying questions to begin with. And then, it seems like a great opportunity for the task leader and the rest of that subgroup to get some feedback from the members on what they see as, really the most promising, maybe some of the most urgent policies here, the ones that might have the biggest impact, the ones that you are really supportive of and passionate about seeing more on. You may also want to ask for or give them some advice about what type of information you'd like to see around these policies that would help you ultimately, come to some agreement about which ones to prioritize and push forward. And then I would suggest also, if you have questions or are thinking about any additional options that you don't see on this list that you want to be sure that the subgroup takes forward or gives some thought to as they continue to do their work. So I would put those three questions on the table. And I guess, David, if there's other types of feedback that'd be helpful for you, and as you're taking these ideas forward, please do ask for it. What else might be helpful for you?
Thanks. So I think those, anything else that folks would like to offer in those three questions, I think are really, really good idea. Thank you for focusing in on those. I open it up to folks, and I'd like to get their reactions.
Okay, I see a few hands, and I apologize, didn't really see the order. Let me go to Christine Donovan and see what you have to say. What's your reaction? Do you have any clarifying questions?
Yeah, great. First, I want to thank Dave for taking the lead and preparing these slides. I think it's a great grounding for the subcommittee. I also just wanted to remind us that I think a different aspect of our assignment this time around for this round of climate and clean energy discussions in Vermont is the need to focus in on those activities that are going to have the greatest impact in cost-effective and equitable greenhouse gas reductions the soonest, by 2025, which is just around the corner first and foremost, and 2030, which isn't that far away either. And what we want to, I think, try not to do, in my opinion, is fall into yet again another iteration of the laundry list of everything possible under the sun that we would ideally like to see happen eventually, but to really focus in on what's going to get the biggest bang, most equitably, the quickest, first and foremost. So I just wanted to add that lens to this, because we've all been around these discussions for a long time, and I think that's part of what distinguishes this assignment this time.
So you're suggesting a way to prioritize some of the issues, some of the opportunities on this list. What has the biggest impact over the near term, 2025, 2030? That helps.
And also to resist the temptation to start adding every possible thing, no matter what its true impact is likely to be in greenhouse gas reductions that's not already on this list.
Okay, so I see a couple of other hands, Richard, and then let's take Richard, Peter next.
So first of all, Dave, thanks very much for the broad and yet concise presentation. That's great. I'll underscore what Christine said about the mandate that we have to choose policies first that will provide the biggest savings quickly and equitably. And to that end, I want to ask Dave to go back to his bar chart. And if you can, that the bar chart to me, showing the blue bars for what we can realistically expect to get from weatherization and efficiency in buildings. Obviously, we're committed to that in this state, and we must do it. But that's not a huge amount of savings compared to the amount of savings that we actually have to achieve. And so, do you have an estimate of how much, in the very broad brush, what do we expect to get from strong policies on weatherization compared to what do we need to get from strong policies on fuel switching?
Rich, I can't pull that information up right now, but as I mentioned, if weatherization is done in the typical fashion, you get about 20 to 25% savings. Currently, Vermont's weatherized maybe about 27,000 homes. We have over 250,000 homes that, if we weatherize everything, that would need to be done by 2050. I think EAN in their pathways sets out a goal of 80,000 homes to be done by 2030. I haven't answered your question exactly because I can't tell you with respect to percentage reductions what you're going to get from weatherization following that pathway versus what you're going to get from these fuel switching. But obviously it's a small piece of this. It's not a third. It's closer to a fifth, perhaps, or a quarter of the reductions you need.
Okay, well, that's an important reminder, following up on Gina's point. Let's focus on what we can achieve more quickly and in greater quantity of reductions. We need to figure out how to do that, effectively, cost effectively, and equitably. But this chart to me speaks powerfully to the need to concentrate on changing or the sources of heat, not just weatherizing.
Thanks for that point, Rich. Did you have another one, or let's move to Peter? Peter, I've got two Peters listed with their hands raised, so I'm going to take Peter Walkie first, and then there's a Peter Guest second.
Thanks. So this is a kind of question for everybody to be thinking about. There's a lot of technological pathways that we can do the math on that would get us there, but it's a question of what's a feasible capital equipment change out in the next 4 or 10 years that really is the basic limiting factor. And obviously some of that is about the strength of the pushes or pulls we have in place. And so it would be helpful as you're thinking through that, Dave and co, to be thinking about sort of what data we want to feed our consultant support. And this is the same thing for transportation, to see what is the normal change out of equipment would look like over that stretch, and how many of those do we need to get, and then how many do we need to push to take transition early, right? So that's a huge question in my mind that I'd love all thought to be thinking about.
And David, feel free to jump in if you have a follow-up question. Go ahead and jump in at any point.
Thank you. No, we're good. These are excellent points. Very helpful.
So there's a Peter Guest. I don't know the.
Okay, Peter Bourne. Thank you.
Okay.
From Bourne Energy. Thank you. So in looking at the trying to reduce the fossil fuel and fuel switching, and looking for the biggest bang for the buck, for lack of a word, of trying to improve the emission level, the biofuels, need to be looked at and be part of the solution here. And the right biofuels, obviously, there's certain biofuels that are not a great choice. But when you look at this and how to do it, B20 is getting very common out there now. That's today. Technology is changing, and I'm thinking if we could look at the biofuels and doing it in to some extent lockstep with the goals So over the years, as the technology improves in relation to either wood to liquids, the bios and all become, technology will make that more practical as we go forward, as we've seen so many changes even in the last few years. So I really like to think that would be part of the solution going forward. It doesn't require, again, no large equipment upgrades or changes, but gets us there in relation to emissions. In relation to, Dave, you mentioned something about the landlords and things of that with heater. We have a certain, there's heaters, the lower the efficiency of the heater normally means that there's certain heaters that don't require electricity. People use them in their camps. They're terribly inefficient, but there's no electricity to run them, so there's not much else you can do, or at least not that we're aware of today. And some of those are being put in tenement houses, which, because they're a cheap heater to put in, or cheap to install. But again, the efficiencies are deplorable. So I really think that looking at that sort of thing is really going to the landlords with what's the incentive for them. They're not, they're to putting that in a better heater or improving the equipment they have, be it whatever they're using for a source, but coming up with some sort of incentive, be it from a tax standpoint, however, that would encourage them to move to do a better upgrade in those houses or in those rentals. But I just wanted to make sure I put that in there, and just thinking that as part of the plan going forward, it really should be looked into. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. That's very helpful. You connecting the quality of the fuel and changing that out with the folks who would be doing that work in the buildings and the incentives that they need to draw their attention. I appreciate you connecting all those.
So Johanna, your hand is up next, and then Jared.
Thank you. And this is, I'm going to get to kind of like a selfish question, because I'm asking the same of our transportation task work in part, but it kind of builds off of something that Peter Walk said and a part of what Peter Bourne said, which is, trying to think about, as we make these recommendations, like how do we, this is all about getting Vermonters, helping them access these clean energy strategies, different strategies. And so sort of that point of purchase moment, and the, sort of really focusing there potentially as a strategy, as we know, in the thermal sector, helping people, maybe, next winter, if their boiler goes out, trying to, at that moment, be there to not lock them into fossil fuel systems, but instead ensure that they are aware of, and that there are other options out there that either, Peter Bourne and Bourne's Energy or others can be providing in that moment. And so I'm just curious, how you all might be thinking about the sort of the intersection of like just the direct connection with the consumers as we make these recommendations, knowing that we can have the laundry list, as Christine said, and we've had a very similar laundry list for a while, but ultimately we need the partnership of Vermonters, and we need to make it affordable and accessible and equitable for them to make these investments. And that point of sale, not locking into fossil fuel strategies, seems really important. I'm just wondering how you might be thinking about that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So you're sort of going down in the outline to the program design level, which is exactly what we need to do. I haven't done that for today, but I can give you one example. I've touched on one already. There's what they call the incentive problem with landlords and tenants. Landlords don't pay energy bills. Tenants don't own anything in the building. So you don't want to get the tenants not really motivated to invest in a water heater that when they leave the building is going to stay with the landlord, nor is the landlord, since he doesn't pay the bills, energy bills, interested in putting in an especially good water heater. So how do you deal with that? I suggested that we just deal with the landlords and encourage them to do that. You can do that with incentives. You can do that with standards too. In other words, the classic carrot and stick. since standards and requirements and regulations are so unpopular, people are obviously going to lean towards the incentives more than the other. But I think you should consider both of those things. Another very typical challenge that efficiency programs have is that when your water heater breaks in the middle of February, you call up whoever, your plumber installed it, and the shower doesn't work. They find your water heater's busted, and they say, I've got another one on the truck, and they come in and put it in. It's done under emergency circumstances. In other words, there's not a whole lot of exchange about best practices or the best appliance or what sort of incentives are available to you. So obviously, we need to think about if there's funding to do this, think about developing a program that would encourage people to think about their water heaters while they're working perfectly well. Was your water heater installed before 1990? Question mark. If so, contact us. We may have a program for you. In other words, what that would do is allow change outs, maybe a little sooner than might otherwise happen, but change outs that could replace that water heater with the best water heater, not just one that I got one on the truck, Mr. Jones kind of exchange. And so you're right that you've got to figure out what the consumer needs and do the best you can to get the consumer interested in that. Those are a couple examples, Joey. I think we have to, explore as many of those examples as possible. As Peter mentioned, there are lots of programs out there. We have excellent efficiency programs. How can we improve those and support them further to maybe do more than they've done in the past, where you're thinking literally about changing out water heaters that don't need changing yet, but might in the next 3 or 4 years, but which will get you the carbon reductions that you're looking for, and ultimately be a cost-effective way at getting at tons.
Yeah, thanks, David. I see we're sort of getting close to the time we had for this discussion, but I want to let the last two folks that had their hands up get in here, Jared and Ed McNamara. And just ask if you can make your comments as concise as possible, and then we'll move on to the transportation. Jared, you're up next.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Catherine. Dave, thank you for your great presentation. Thank you and Christine for the good work. I want to comment briefly on weatherization. And I want to share my screen to show some numbers from the EAN emissions reduction pathways model that you were referencing, Dave. Can folks see my screen right now? Okay, great. So the first thing to say about weatherization is that it really has a dual benefit in terms of emissions reduction. There is the direct reduction, and you can measure that here, a direct reduction in emissions from using less fuel. But it also opens up, once it is done, the opportunity to switch to heating sources that may not be available short of that weatherization. So I'll just give a very quick personal example. When I moved into my very old house, it had a fuel oil furnace that was using about 1,000 gallons of fuel oil a year. The next spring after we moved in, we did a whole house retrofit that cut the heat load in half and made it so we could then heat the entire house with a pellet stove. And we still have that furnace's backup that we use B100. But if we hadn't done the weatherization, we wouldn't be able to meet our whole heat load for that old house with a pellet stove. So I just think I want us to remember that even if the direct benefits in terms of emissions reduction from weatherization may be smaller relative to some of these other things that we need to do in terms of ramping up beneficial electrification of heating and ramping up our sustainable, efficient use of wood heat and biofuels like biodiesel and RNG, oftentimes we're not going to be able to do that as well or at the scale and with as much resiliency as we would want in Vermont winters, including redundant heating sources, until and unless we weatherize a lot of buildings. I would just say here, to give a sense of scale, Dave introduced this well. We model in terms of, and this is all going back to modeling each sector meeting its proportional emissions reduction requirements. There is no silver bullet here. We're going to have to do a lot of work. But for instance, as of 2018, 27,000 homes weatherized, averaging about 25% energy savings. This model has that going to 80,000 homes by 2025, which basically on average would be weatherizing 10,000 homes a year in Vermont, not the current pace of only about 2,000 homes a year. And you can see these significant, we're talking about really rapid and significant market transformation curves that are already underway in a lot of ways. Not, weatherization has been fairly flat, but we see significant increase of use of heat pumps, of heat pump water heaters, and some of these other kind of key measures are taking off as well. But I just wanted to share that to give a sense of context and scale and pace, and just a reminder to everybody on the Science and Data Subcommittee and on the Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee that this resource has been shared with you and exists as a reference point. I am going to see now if I can stop my share screen. I seem to have lost my screen. Can someone steal the screen back from me? I can't access the Teams.
While you're struggling with that, can I go on to Ed's comment and see what Ed wanted to add?
There we go.
There you go. That worked.
Great, thanks. I was actually going to make a pretty similar point to Jared, although I didn't have the nice graphics to illustrate it. And then the other point, though, also about the importance of weatherization and also building disclosure as well, is that's a great point to actually identify your water heater might fail in the next couple of years. Your boiler could stand to be upgraded in the next couple of years. Like, weatherization has a lot of knock-on benefits in addition to just the reduction in fuel savings.
Yeah. Great, thanks for that emphasis. And I just want to come back to you, David, and see if you wanted to say anything about sort of what your next steps as a subgroup are, where you think you're going to get to before your next opportunity to share back with this group. I think you've gotten a lot of good ideas of additional things to think about, ways to think about it, but what are you going to do next?
Well, I first I want to thank everybody for the comments, and I'd welcome others. If you cogitate a little bit and have other comments to share with me, please send them along. These are really helpful. And what I've got to do and what the rest of us have to do, are working on this. We'll have to start drafting things along the lines of what was discussed before we took our break. We have to start piecing these things out, pointing out the benefits, the likely effects, and scrape together the information we can find to make the case as to why we should do X as opposed to Y. Stack them up and see how we get there in the way of carbon reductions. See if we can demonstrate that they're the most cost-effective approaches, and as Christine mentioned earlier on, highlight the ones that can happen sooner than later.
Yeah. Well, great. You may get some additional feedback when we get to the public comment, which is why we're going to kind of keep moving here. And Rich, you want to introduce the task lead for the transportation sector? Thanks again, David.
You bet.
Joey, I think you were prepared to present, but perhaps Gina also?
Yes.
Okay.
We're tag teaming.
So I'm turn over to Johanna and Gina.
Okay, great.
All right. Thank you. Well, apologies that we don't have a PowerPoint, but we're going to aim for one next time, or to frame this out a bit more concretely and visually. But Gina and I are going to pivot off each other to first sort of set a broad frame and then share with you some of the high-level strategies we've been exploring with several other transportation and land use experts. But first I'm going to start with the high frame, then turn it over to Gina in a few minutes. We're going to cruise through some of those strategies, and I would say that we really welcome and would benefit from your input. this conversation we were having in terms of some of, the approaches I think are related to buildings or directly related to the transportation sector. So I appreciate the input already. But again, sort of grounding all of us, as we all know, transportation's the sector that results in almost half of Vermont's greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a huge nut to crack, and likely, in rural Vermont, our biggest challenge. So when it comes to transportation progress, we're going to need to make significant market transformation, behavioral strategy change. Yep.
Joey, could we just interrupt? Hey, Dave Farnsworth, can you hit the X on your screen, please?
Yeah, it's a little disconcerting to see two different. Thank you. Okay. So
sorry, keep going.
No, that's okay. That's helpful for me too. So, it's going to take significant transformation, market transformation, behavioral strategy change. It's going to take time. It's going to take money. And in the short term, especially, it's going to take a serious laser focus on reducing the reliance on the combustion of fossil fuels. And so that's true for Vermont. That's true, nationally and globally. So I would say, sort of promisingly, as we tackle the significant challenge, it's important to remember that we're not doing this alone, that other states, regions, and nations globally are simultaneously tackling this, and that we have a lot of the technologies and strategies at our fingertips to make the progress that we're going to need. And I do believe it is, like how are we going to prioritize based on, cost effectiveness, equity, and like what is going to work for, the world we live in and the different players and partners, and, how do we make this work from the consumer perspective? So we've been focusing our work and the conversations to date on the significant pollution reduction progress we need to make by 2025 as a start. So core to that is really core focus on electrification, reducing vehicle miles traveled, and then setting the stage for longer term compact community development. So a couple of other things before we dig into the strategies. So a lot of this, talk about making this transformation possible really has to do with how do we make it possible financially for Vermonters? And so there are a lot of different ways to do that. We can begin by shifting existing public priorities and investments and budgets that promote the direction we want and need to go. Promisingly, as we heard earlier from Peter, we can use and should use the federal dollars strategically that are coming into the state to use this moment in time as a significant opportunity. There are potential, through the American Rescue Plan Act dollars and a potential ensuing infrastructure bill. So we're going to need, to lean into that and really focus on the opportunity there. And just in general, lean on the federal government more in this moment to make the progress that we're going to need. And there's a lot of hope there. So, because when it comes to transportation, this is a regional issue. It is a national issue. So there are things that Vermont can do alone. And then there are also things that you need to partner with the region and, as a nation to really undertake. So, and just to underscore that we're going to probably need to raise revenues to do this and to use those revenues to prioritize supporting the solutions for Vermonters in particular who already bear a higher energy and climate burden, lower income or vulnerable Vermonters of color. So how we design programs in partnership with the Just Transition Subcommittee and in general over the course of time is going to be really key to getting the equity component right. But I think, we're going to begin to shift this market ourselves and again, look to the federal government and to the private sector, which is also really promisingly evolving. I mean, as we talked about before, we have big players like manufacturers like General Motors that are embracing the future progress we need, committing to electrification of singularly electrification of their vehicles by 2035. So just sort of, again, ground our work. We have the statutory pollution reduction targets that the legislature has put in place that are guiding our work. And I really appreciated the update earlier in terms of how the Just Transitions Committee is organizing their work. This is going to be further guided by the principals and partnerships of those folks there. And we're going to need a lot of multifaceted solutions. So I'm going to turn it over to Gina in just one moment to sort of walk through our draft initial thoughts and approaches, but just wanted to sort of say it's not comprehensive. It's a start. We're recognizing that some of these are pretty big strategies that we're going to likely need to employ. You know, and many of the strategies, though, that we are laying out there have been explored or in action in other states, nations, and provinces, like our neighbors to the north in Quebec. So many of these are not new ideas, but they're ideas that we can either expand upon. As several of you have noted, we have good programs in place already to build from that can really sort of accelerate this work. So I am really looking forward to hearing more from you in terms of what we're going to share with you now and some of the sort of initial draft thoughts and strategies, and that, you know, we're really looking forward to figuring out which ones are going to work, how we modify for the moment, how we make improvements. But again, just sort of a focus for us, and, you know, I just want to sort of underscore this as we turn to the strategy component, is really helping in this moment, looking at 2025, mostly in this moment, and 2030 as well, just reducing reliance on fossil fuels and the combustion of, you know, combustion engines, and shifting far more to electrification, high efficiency strategies, and providing people other options for getting where they need to go. And again, how we do this is really going to be critical to drive the sort of cost-effective equity outcomes. And that's where we're looking forward to. I'm going to ask you, Gina, to sort of start with the higher level strategies that we've been conferring, and I'm going to pivot off of you. And I think, at least I would say, that I would really benefit from your input as a broader cross-sector mitigation subcommittee in this moment to really round out what we're sharing with you in this now, and then help us look towards further refining all of this. Gina, you want to take it from here, and I can.
Sure. I'll walk through the nuts and bolts of where we're at right now. Just as an overview, the efforts, we have 19 different strategies. Well, I guess they're not strategies, they're pathways at this point. There is a ton of work to do, putting meat on the bones of these things, a ton of work. And it's also just a list of, it's a list of a lot of what's been done already and ideas that are practiced around the country, as Joey said. But we're interested in hearing from you of what's missing and other great ideas that we haven't even thought of. So anyway, we're focused in 3 areas. Fuels, that means switching from fossil fuels to fuels that have none to less carbon content, including but not limited to electricity and maybe eventually hydrogen, and then of course biofuels, the extent of which we need a lot of work to do. The technology, so that's number 1. Number 2 is technology, supporting transition to heavy and light duty vehicle technologies that allow for fuel switching and are also better for energy conservation. And then thirdly is demand reduction, and that's reducing single occupancy vehicle use through smart growth, reduce reliance on single occupancy vehicles, and increasing transportation demand management, bike, ped, rail, transit programs, and the associated infrastructure. So we went about this exercise by setting up some goals and approaches, if you will, to achieving, and this is the 2025 targets. We had to separate 2025 blueprint from 2030 strategies from the big 2050 long-term goals or long-term picture. So these goals and approaches must create diverse transportation choices that meet personal needs and benefit the state's economy, prioritize equity and address the most vulnerable. The benefits must be quantifiable to get us, and this is to the extent possible, to add up to achieving the state's emissions reductions in line with the statutory requirements. So we're not just throwing money at something, but we're throwing money at something that's going to, and the amount of money we need to actually get there. We're going to prioritize options that have economic benefits, such as jobs, reduced cost of living, keeping dollars in state. We're going to strive to include all stakeholders on program design and deployment, And the program and policy designs will be required to achieve cost-effective greenhouse gas reductions and equity outcomes for all. We want to support and partner with the existing network of transportation providers. We want ease of implementation, and that may mean, most likely will mean building on successful existing programs. We want to incentivize behavior to achieve emissions goals and disincentivize those that don't. We want to, this is really important from transportation, we want to recognize and actively work with other states and the federal government on US and multi-state programs and policies, some of which we're already doing, the California standards, CAFE, TCI, NESCOM, to help achieve Vermont's emissions reductions. We're part of a larger economy, this is a larger way of thinking about what the states can do, what it can't do alone. State government must take on a leadership role at the highest levels, and agency actions are coordinated through well-supported interagency mechanisms to get there. And we're going to harness all this federal largesse that's coming upon us now in the most cost-effective way possible. So then we have these criteria, if you will, and I would love to see others think about these strategies in terms of criteria. And our criteria are pretty simple. We want to see what the greenhouse gas reduction potential is in line with the goals, the cost effectiveness and economic health and other benefits, furthering equity outcomes, technologies that are widely available now in the near term, and then working towards the state's long-term goals by supporting smart growth, land use smart growth, infrastructure investments in transit, rail, et cetera, through reducing VFT. And then finally, an understanding of the full cost as well as the revenues and other resources needed to implement. So those are our criteria, and we're just starting to hold up our strategies or pathways to these criteria. And they're in somewhat of an order. I'm going to go through them now. Number one is, and this is not in any order of preference. This is just the way they're coming out here in our work so far. Is Vermont participating in the TCI program? Corey, there's been a lot of analysis done on this in terms of the emissions benefits, the proceeds it'll bring to the state. We kind of have a leg up on this one because a lot of work's been done on this already. The second item is EV incentive programs, and we're talking about purchase programs and determining, we will need to determine what extent incentive programs drive sales that it will achieve EAN's numbers for us. And EAN has told us that we're going to need 30,000 registered EVs and 103,849 partial EVs in order to get to the next goal. Right now, we've been spending a lot of money and we have a minuscule number of EVs. So just to give you an extent of the challenge, in order to do this and get to where we need to be, we're going to have to up our game. How that program is structured is work to be done. Obviously, the programs need to be structured to benefit low-income families first, as which is one of our basic criteria. There are potential fuel savings for families. There's dollars kept in state and all the associated economic benefits of EVs. We need to figure that all out as we look at these incentive programs. Then we move on to charging programs, public charging. And this is downtown and village centers, roadway corridors, hospitals, shopping centers, employment centers. Again, we need to determine the optimum geographic coverage to achieve the 30,000 BEVs and 103,849 partial EVs. How many do we need out there? And we need information to help us make sure we're not wasting money. I mean, there's some research going on right now that level 2 is inadequate, and we should be putting that stuff in downtown areas. People don't use it because it doesn't deliver the energy fast enough. We need to be looking at level 3 deployment. Level 3 is expensive. You need 3-phase power. So how do we weigh that? Those are the kinds of things we need to figure out quickly, because this money is going to be descending on us, and the worst thing we can do is waste it on the wrong type of infrastructure.
Gina, can I interrupt
Sure.
just briefly? This is Catherine. Are there 19 of these?
Yes, and I'm.
So I would want to suggest that if
I'll just list them.
I'm just going to
list them. I could talk about each one of these, and we all could for a very long time.
So just to give them an overview
and
get to this.
So then there's EVC funding for residential and utility customers and partnerships with utilities on getting that stuff out. And that could be level 1 or level 2. EV charging rate design, we're up to number 5 now for residential and public facilities. EVCE building codes, number 6. Number 7, public EV charging interoperability in the future. And that's more of a challenge than a strategy, but we've got to try to crack that nut as we talk about charging infrastructure. Number 8 is expanding Drive Electric Vermont, which provides technical expertise, evaluates trends, et cetera, market and otherwise, and promotes EVs to the public on behalf of the state. Fee-bait program is number 9. This would be the fee-bait program for the purchase and use tax for new vehicles within a given class at point of sale. Number 10 is the Replace Your Ride program and expand Mileage Smart. Number 11 is right now, and we're just starting to learn about this, CARB and NESCAM are entering into an MOU on heavy-duty vehicles. What does that mean for the state in terms of shifting heavy-duty vehicles to more climate-friendly fuels? Number 12 is heavy-duty and mid-duty research funding and other mechanisms to achieve a cleaner and more efficient fleet. 13 is now we get into reducing VMT, and these are we have to keep working on this stuff, but we're not going to see the benefits until further out. So reducing VMT and increasing transportation options through transit, that's 13, through bike ped, that's 14, through rail, that's 15, through TDM programs like Go Vermont, that's 16. So those are the reduced VMT options. We could be exploring a VMT tax to pay for road infrastructure to replace the lost gas tax revenues. This would be calculated at registration and inspection. And then making sure COVID and other infrastructure funding is directed to downtown and village areas. Now, this is the money that I don't think Peter did talk about, which is the wastewater and water and all those funds. It's really important in our long-term view of transportation to make sure we're supporting downtown and village areas and not encouraging sprawl through our infrastructure investments, because with sprawl, you're challenged in terms of transit, bike ped, and other programs. And then finally, 19 is biofuels, ethanol, and biodiesel, and to what extent it makes sense for the transportation sector now and in the future. So that's the list, and we welcome your ideas. Are we at the right level? This is not rocket science. These are all things that many of us have been talking about for several years.
Well,
we open it up.
Catherine, can I make a quick point of clarification? Vermont has already joined the medium and heavy duty ZEV MOU.
Okay.
It's about what the next steps are in terms of whether Vermont adopts the next phases in California's emissions regulations with regards to medium and heavy duty vehicles.
Thank you, Peter.
Perfect. So that was a lot for folks to hold in their head, but yeah, I would just go back to kind of our discussion questions, which are: did you hear anything that really resonated with you that you'd like to make sure gets pushed forward in this next phase? Are there things that are missing? And what additional information would you like to be seeing as they go forward with their work? So let's go to hands. Anybody want to jump in here? Liz.
Hey, it's a pretty minor point, but you mentioned, Gina, the emphasis on level 3, and totally agree. From a public charging network, that's hugely important. I just want to at least have us not lose sight of the benefit of level 2, even going forward at places like, well, certainly places of employment or schools or other places where people stay and remain throughout the day, because it can really help soak up local generation that has a more day following profile like solar. So we really see that as at GMP as something that needs to continue and will, but just want to make sure that in the description of the need to encourage L3 in the public charging network, we don't inadvertently sort of put aside the need to encourage more L2 as well in the right places for daytime charging as we look ahead.
Can I just note something on that really quickly? Thank you, Liz. We will, and I think that's absolutely right. We did talk about level 3 largely around like the higher travel corridors on like highways and things like that, where people want to, where they're not charging all day, but they're going to come in and out. So like that level of, we're working to get into that level of detail, but that's a really important point.
Thanks. Kelly, you're up. And then David.
Thanks. All of the thought you're already putting into making sure that this is equitable and all that is excellent. There are a couple things that I want to make sure are highlighted. One, tax credits usually don't work for low income people because they don't have a tax liability. And that sort of plays into even if there's like a deferred, you pay up front X amount, but down the road you're going to have fuel savings, but that's not going to work either for people who maybe don't have any savings to fall back on. And also financing options are going to be limited for a lot of low income people because of credit issues and things like that, or if there is like a down payment required and things. So considering making financing really accessible is another thing. And then a lot of people are going to be purchasing used vehicles, and the used vehicles are way less likely to be electric. So I don't know if you guys are looking into, as you build this out, how to maybe have people trade in their hybrids for electrics, get those hybrids into the used market. Things like that might help with some of the low-income Vermonters who are much more likely to pick up a used vehicle, getting one that's at least, even if it's not fully electric, at least is much more efficient. So I just wanted to highlight those things as you guys are considering this, but you're already clearly thinking about it a lot, which is excellent. So thanks.
I would just say absolutely to all of the above.
We really look to the low-income community to help us define, what's the need out there, mm-hmm. and how we're going to deploy these programs. I mean, we have one program now. We have Good News Garage. We have a bunch of different ways people are accessing transportation. How do we build on those, make them better, and make them work for people? So we definitely want to go to the Just Transgressions group with a list of more technical questions.
Thank you. So David, you're up.
Thanks. I think it's great. I love this list that you all have put together. I have a few observations about the near-term stuff. I think the near-term is really important, getting things going. A lead by example. It'd be great if the state government started buying EVs more. I think making incentives available for leases, for used vehicles, as Kelly just suggested, I think is really important. The low-income folks just don't have the flexibility, and people don't buy used cars. I mean, a large swath of the population just does not buy a new car. They buy used cars. So putting those in front of folks who don't have that financial flexibility, however you can do that, I think is really important. I didn't see it on your list. It's a short-term idea. It's straight out of the Carter administration. It's putting, say, a 5-year program for lowering the speed of trucks on 89 and 91. Vermont has the authority to lower speed limits. You will save money, not just for fuel that's been sold in Vermont, but fuel that's been sold elsewhere and brought into Vermont. You'll avoid, you probably could avoid significant emissions. It wouldn't be a huge cost. It would be a really good jump start on saving emissions from trucks, electric trucks that are only being planned for now and just and aren't really economical at the moment. So that would be a start I'd toss in. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. We've thought long and hard. We pushed that one out to further out, not for 2025. Just given what I know of the requirements around changing the speed limit on the interstate is not for the faint of heart in terms of federal involvement. Maybe the federal government has changed and it won't be anymore. Who knows? But I don't know when that's going to happen in DOT. But we definitely have that on our radar. It's just not in the 2025 scenario.
Christine?
I just want to thank you very much for your 2025 focus and your specific and concrete and actionable list. I think it's right on.
I would just say that we will refine this a little further and then share it with you all so that it can be something you can visually look at and help, collectively refine. I think taking your input is at this moment is super helpful, and we're thinking about a lot of these things already, but we need to be thinking about and addressing some of the other really important things you are raising. So thank you. Other input, really welcome.
I don't see any other hands immediately, but the public is standing by waiting to give you some additional input, I expect. So actually, I may have pushed you too fast, Gina, because now we have an extra 5 minutes, but we'll give that over to some public comment. So Rich and Peter, do you want to manage that, or I can keep going here? But I don't know that I can see the attendees. So I'm not sure who has the capability to see the hands raised from the attendees or the chats.
Right. So Catherine, I can see, last time I could see hands from guests. Right at the moment, I don't see any hands up except Dave Farnsworth. And now there's one new hand has gone up.
That was a vestigial hand, Rich. It's now disappeared.
Right, but there's one more out there.
Linda Gray. Hand is up.
Great, Linda, you're on.
Yeah, we're not hearing anything, Linda. Can you try again?
Yeah, that's not working.
We need to do anything technologically to to allow them to unmute.
I can't do that.
Who's our Teams master here?
It's not like Zoom where you have to promote them or anything.
Yeah.
Linda is currently muted, and
all right. So
you can help her with that.
I was going to make a comment towards the end there, and I'm happy to hear from members of the public, including Linda, if she can rejoin us. But I also wanted to thank Joey and Gina for that list, and to encourage a focus on near-term actions, and also to encourage continued focus on making these programs available to lower income, rural working Vermonters. And I think the program design can go a long way in doing that. So I'm hopeful that we're going to be able to come up with programs that are realistic in that fashion. And, mention financing was mentioned, leases were mentioned, focusing it to a degree on the used market to the degree we can. There probably are a bunch of program design features that could be deployed, and we should, I want to encourage you all to think really hard about that.
I would just offer to participants *6 to unmute if they haven't tried that yet.
Can I just respond to that? I don't want to get in front of public comment, but
right now there are no hands up, Joey. So
I see George Gross's, but let me just so back to like the comment that I made earlier. It feels like a long time ago, in terms of thinking about the different strategies and some of the things we generally know we're going to need to be doing. I do wonder about if there is some sort of public process or just the beginning of a conversation with the Just Transition Subcommittee about like, we know we really need to like reduce fossil fuel use and combustion as a core strategy. Here are some like buckets of things, and get them thinking about early on how we design our thinking. And so that if we're talking about helping people move into more high efficiency vehicles as a short-term strategy, what does that mean? Like, are there, from their perspective? So, and anyway, I just am trying to think about like, how do we have an iterative process so we're not like going down two parallel paths, and I don't know what that looks like, but I feel like we generally know a lot of the things that we need to be doing. Yeah, Jane, I would welcome your thoughts.
Well, I guess I totally want to say I hear you, Joey, and I feel like that's what we're trying to set up. Like it's not two parallel paths. Like nobody has suggested that really, and I do really feel like the conversation that's starting in Just Transitions is just that, a place to start. And then the intent, I firmly believe, is to bring subcommittees in early on to help guide what that engagement process looks like from each subcommittee's perspective. So I firmly believe that it won't be like Just Transitions thinking about it on their own. The whole point is just to set up a foundation to bring in the conversation and inputs from the other subcommittees. So, because I totally hear you, like there's messaging that needs to happen and strategies that we know are going to be part of the plan no matter what. And nobody knows that more than the subcommittees working on it.
So nothing would stop us right now from reaching out to our liaison to Just Transitions and asking to sit down with a few of their members to run some ideas by them. That could happen.
Not at all. I mean, I totally think that. I also just want to echo that I think there'll be an actual process to do that also. But of course, Kelly's here and you should start to have that dialogue.
Can I interrupt? Linda has found her way back in and has her hand up again. I'd love to use our time for public comment appropriately.
Good.
Linda, can we hear you?
Yes, I hope so. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yay. Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, I figured out what you have to do for teams. So thank you. And I just have a comment and a couple points to make. So my comment is, it is just so exciting to be able to sit in and observe so much activity at the state level about climate action. Thanks to the Climate Council and all the subcommittees. So I'm extremely pleased. So my comment is, I want to just echo what some other folks like Jeff Forward said earlier, and then some of your subcommittee members have identified that you just really need, I want to encourage you to identify the near-term actions that can move us quickly on cutting emissions. So you guys have recognized that. Please keep that uppermost in your mind. And then I think you can do the same on equity issues, like identify the near-term things that you can move on that, and recognize that there'll be ongoing time to perfect that. And then another idea that I want to suggest to you as you go out for public comment, there's a concept that I'm sure many of you are familiar with called deliberative polling. And I think that that would be a useful thing to keep in mind. I remember that it was when it was the Public Service Commission, I think at some point they use that, say 10 years ago or more, and it's a method where when you're many people who will want to chime in on your plans will be people who have been working on energy and climate issues for a while, but you also want to get people who have not, and the kind you can get, I think, better feedback if you provide people some understanding of the issues and stuff, and a deliberative polling approach can help you with that. And then last, I have a comment that arises just from listening to the discussion a few minutes ago about transportation initiatives. And I did want to highlight, I didn't hear specific mention of electric assist bikes. And I want to just highlight that. I'm sure that they're not missing from the list, but in the context of non-car transportation, please include them. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda, very much. That I'm not seeing any other hands. That actually does flag something that I've wanted to mention as we are all aggressively focused on those near-term targets, is that one of the worries that I have in taking our work and communicating it outward is that if our December plan doesn't find a way to highlight things that we want to continue to work on, that it will not be seen as part of the climate action plan for Vermont. And so while it may not be baked, it may not be ready, it may not be the priority in the near term, there are a number of issues that we're going to have to continue to work on. And if we don't include that in the plan, we'll lose the opportunity to keep it as part of the mix for all of our work moving forward, because people will go, well, that wasn't in the plan. Why are you talking about that? And so just keep that. It's a subtle nuance, but we are deep in this, and we know that we're going to get to these things. Nobody else does.
That's a really good point, Peter. Jane used a phrase early at the beginning of this meeting, which I appreciated, and she said she was thinking about what you were just saying, and pointing out that we could advance our no regrets policies pretty aggressively in the plan, and then also identify the future action items that we know we need to continue work on. And that would allow us to present a comprehensive plan, even though we wouldn't necessarily have the same level of detail across all policies. So that's a strategy to keep in mind. I would also note that it's important for us, when we think about early action items, that we do think of them as no regret action items. That is, we don't want to do something fast that we would have to undo in the midterm. Ideally, we would want any of our early action items to be ones that are, on the right path towards later action items. And I'm perhaps stating the obvious, but there might be some short-term action items that we would end up looking back on and saying, well, that was a mistake. We shouldn't have, tried to get those early tons, because now we have to undo it.
Christine's wanted to add something there.
Yeah, riffing off what Rich and Peter just said, we very mindfully wrote in the consultants, in the RFP for the consultant, a clear statement about the work for the 2050 portion of the plan, or their contribution to our thinking about what to put in the plan, should be thinking about things that need further assessment and further development and further work in the future, post post the priorities that end up in the plan for the shorter term. So I think we're in alignment, should be in alignment once the consultant's up and running as well, for being able to have that conversation and being sure to leave that information and those thoughts behind for the future work. So that was a good reminder from you, Peter. Thank you for that.
Are there any other comments or discussion points from members of the committee? We don't need to stay on until the top of the hour, I don't think. If we've done everything we need to do today, everybody could get back 5 minutes of their day.
So Rich, is the plan for the next meeting that the other two subgroups will do a similar type of presentation? And is there other items on the agenda that will take up the other portion?
That is such a good question. The answer to the first part is yes. As we set out last time, we expect power sector and non-energy to be presented in a similar fashion next time. That's number one. But number two, are there other topic areas in addition to the liaison reports, which probably should be a routine matter, that people think we should have on the agenda for next time?
Rich, I would offer that at that point, hopefully we'll have some more information from Jane about steering committee decisions relative to in what kind of format and information we need to provide for the following meeting. And so having a discussion on what that would look like, I think would be useful for all of us.
Thank you. Christine, up to.
I think Peter just answered my question. Thank you.
Any other topics that you anticipate, Jane?
Nope, not
Okay.
now.
All right. I mean, we'll have a chance. Peter and I and you can talk about it. And as usual, I want to invite any member of the committee to communicate with us about any item on the agenda or any other comment, frankly. And I think I'm looking at everybody's face here, and I think we're ready to adjourn. And I want to do that and thank you all for a great session and really great input today. All right, thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.